This is your Professor Ian again. This is part 2 of my slides on the Iliad. So we left off talking about these Greek values, Xenia, and others. So let's move on. I just want to think about the role the gods play in this book, because you're going to see them intervening a lot. And it's super interesting, the roles that they play. These are not really the gods of the theogony. They're not these grandiose gods in some ways. They are, but at the same time, as I note here, the gods in the Iliad act in ways we don't expect gods to really work. They're petty. They get wounded by mortals at times. Ares is shown to be kind of a bully, right? So the gods are not really revered in some ways as being these holy figures that everybody needs to respect. They seem to play, they intervene, they come in and out of the action whenever they feel like it, as almost these chaotic forces at times, right? They're far from omnipotent. In fact, there are points where Zeus is, weighing the scales of the fates, or he's dictated by the fates, and even he can't intervene in certain things. So the gods are important parts of this, but they are not maybe what you would expect in some ways. They can be very petty, and they fight with each other, and they take sides, and they have favorites, and so on and so forth. Some of them sometimes used for comic relief. Hephaestus, when he's trying to play the peacekeeper between Zeus and Hera, is this kind of comic figure. Again, Ares, the god of battle and war, runs away from battle like a coward, right? So, or at least that's how he's characterized in the poem. So, they come off as petty, they're argumentative, they're biased, right? They're not these kind of otherworldly, supernatural, better than human figures. They seem to be down and dirty with the humans. So it's something to think about as you're reading through here. Right? The role of the gods and the interaction between the gods and the humans in the story. Like I say here, one of the things you should be thinking about as you're reading through is what role they play. One of the themes of the Iliad is war, of course. And one of the things you should ask yourself, it does valorize war in a lot of ways, but there are moments, when Hector is just, there's a number of moments where Hector is thinking about whether he should go and fight Achilles, whether they should try to end this war. It's costing them so much. If they made peace now, they could, the Trojans and the Greeks could each go their separate ways and kind of not destroy each other in this way. Because, spoiler alert, we don't really see the end of the Trojan War in the Iliad, but, their fate is sealed. They're going to be, they are destroyed, in Legends of Troy after after the Iliad. Troy is sacked and completely destroyed. All the women are sold into slavery. All the men are either murdered or sold into slavery. It's a brutal end for Troy, and the Greeks really exact their revenge. But as we're going to see when we get into the Odyssey, most of the Greek heroes that took a leading role in the Iliad don't have happy endings. They are punished by the gods for their kind of over punishment of the Trojans in some ways. So, even though this story is very much valorizing these Greek values of war, it's also an interesting critique of them. Achilles is the hero, but is he totally justified in the things that he does? The revenge he gets for his fallen friend or lover, depending on how you want to read it, is that fair? Are these good values? There is a bit of a critique. It's not all one-sided. So this is something to think about as you're reading through as well. So let's think about what the Iliad is not. The Iliad is only part of the story. As I said at the beginning, some of the most famous parts of the story of Troy, what we think of as when we think of the Trojan War, are not even part of the Iliad. And the Iliad is part of something that we call the Trojan Cycle. So there's a whole cycle of epic poems that tell this whole story, and I've put up a document charting that out if you want to take a look. This is just part of the story, right? The Iliad, there's poems talking about what happened before, there's poems talking about what happens after. The Iliad is just one chapter in this larger epic cycle of poetry. Not all written by Homer. Homer is credited with writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, although they're very different books. And here's a little map I thought would be interesting to look at. Here's, Athens and Sparta, some of the big most important Greek cities. And up here is where, archaeologists pinpoint Troy as probably being. And so this would be what we call Troyland, Asia Minor. This is called as well. This is getting to the Asian continent. If we go to the west here, right? So this is called Asia Minor. In some people call it Asia Minor. So this is where the Greeks came. This is where they sailed from over here, and they went to Troy. And so before the war, they're sacking cities up the coast before they get to Troy, and that's where they're sacking cities, destroying cities and selling their enemies into slavery, and just taking everything. So let's do a little bit of background. The children of Leda, Leda and the swan, of course, impregnated by Zeus. She had a number of children, including Helen and Clytemnestra, names we've come across, at least Clytemnestra we heard about last week. Helen, of course, is the beautiful woman who launched the 1,000 ships because Paris took her off. And here is a depiction of Helen, of course, not from the era, but a depiction of Hera. She was, daughter of Zeus, so she's this beautiful woman. And her father, well, her mortal father, not Zeus, he didn't, everybody, of course, wanted to marry Helen. She's the daughter of a king. She's the daughter of Zeus, super beautiful, the most beautiful woman in Greece. And everybody wanted to marry her, but of course, her father, Tyndareus, didn't want to marry her because he knew he would offend other people, if he gave her hand to somebody and rejected another suitor. So Odysseus came up with a solution. All the suitors that were interested in her had to swear that they would stand by whoever is chosen. They had to enter into a protective treaty. So when Menelaus won, all the other suitors swore that they would help protect this union between Menelaus and Helen. And that's part of the backstory for the Trojan War, because when Paris takes off with Helen, all these other suitors have this promise that they made, this oath that they made, that they would help Menelaus get her back. So it's kind of it's similar in some ways to the cause of World War I, right, where Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and it set in motion these protective treaties between all the different European nations. If you read about World War I, that's really what led to the war. It was like there was the assassination of this fairly minor royal figure, Hungarian royal, that led to this grand world war, and then which caused World War II as well, and the Cold War. But I won't go on that. But it all came about because of these protective treaties, and that's what's happening here as well before the war. So in Troy, Priam, he's the king of Troy. He had a giant family. Paris is one of his children. There was a prophecy about Paris that he would be the downfall of the city, so he was left to die on Mount Ida. But a nymph, so a minor god figure, Inoni, raised him, brought him back, and eventually he was brought back into the Trojan kingdom. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, this is all before the Iliad, by the way, right? This is all that's happening. There's a marriage between Peleus and a minor sea deity, Thetis, and Zeus invites all the gods, except for the goddess of discord, Eris. She gets jealous and she throws a golden apple with the inscription "to the fairest" to the crowd, which causes Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena to get into a fight for this apple. And Zeus doesn't want to deal with this, so he throws the apple to Earth, throws it at Mount Olympus, where, of course, Paris finds it. Paris is, out tending sheep. And, there are different versions of this story. Some say that he was being punished for misbehaving or something. But anyways, he's out looking after the sheep. He finds this apple. The three goddesses appear, and they offer him different things. Hera offers him power, Athena wisdom, and Aphrodite offers him the love of the most beautiful woman. And of course, Paris, being a young man, not in control of his hormones perhaps, chooses pleasure and love, and he gives the apple to Aphrodite. This is called the Judgment of Paris, famously. This is a very famous mythological moment that, this sets in motion the Trojan War as well, in some ways. Okay, so then in Sparta, so Paris is sent to Sparta on a diplomatic mission, right, to see Agamemnon and Menelaus. He meets Helen, and there are different versions of this. Does he seduce Helen? Does he kidnap Helen? There are different versions of this. The end result is the same. He leaves Sparta with Helen, whether willingly or unwillingly, when Menelaus is along, right? So again, there's this protective treaty. Everybody has to help Menelaus get Helen back. And as I mentioned in my last lecture, the Trojans were not happy with this because Paris is breaking those laws of Xenia by absconding with someone else's wife. Right? There's a lawfully married couple, and he's taking off with this woman and breaking the laws of hospitality along with it. But they have no choice because they have to stand up for their kin, Paris. Right? And in the Iliad, Priam talks about this, and he's tortured by it, but there's little he can do. So afterwards, the troops assemble as the Greek troops. Odysseus pretends to be insane, right? So he doesn't have to go fight because he doesn't want anything to do with this. He's on his island. He's in his kingdom in Ithaca. He doesn't want to fight. So Agamemnon's friend throw his son Telemachus, who we're going to see in the Odyssey a lot more, in front of his plow to test him, and he pulls his plow aside so he doesn't hit his son and reveals that he's sane and he has to go fight. Just a funny little episode. Well, maybe not funny, but interesting. And Achilles has been hidden. His mother has hidden him on the island of Skyros as a young woman, which is, I always find humorous to, Achilles, the greatest warrior, who must be like rippling with muscles and all that kind of stuff, is, disguised as a young woman. There's a lot of cross-dressing in Greek myth, so it's an interesting feature of that, the way they play with the gender roles and such. So Odysseus goes to find him. He pretends to be a peddler, selling dresses and weapons, right? So there's these two choices, and of course Achilles, this very masculine guy, goes straight for the weapons. He can't help himself. So we would consider this very sexist, that all the women are looking at the dresses and the jewelry, and of course Achilles, the warrior, can't help himself but pick up the swords. Anyways, here's a Renaissance era painting of the scene, right? This is Achilles, looking pretty buff in that dress, right? He can't help but go to the swords. I just find that a humorous depiction. So they've assembled the troops then in Aulis, which is a Greek port city. They're about to set sail. The fleet of Greek ships is about to set sail for Troy, right? Remember that map I showed you? They need to cross, the Aegean Sea to get to Troy. Somehow, and there are different versions of this, Agamemnon has offended Artemis, and so they need to placate her. And so to do so, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia. Right, and there are different versions of this. Some have her being replaced by a sacred deer, but most accounts of the myth have Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia to get the winds to cross over to Troy. Okay, anyway, so before the Iliad, we have the Greeks have spent 9 years fighting against the Trojans. So they've been going up and down the coast and attacking coastal cities, sacking cities. And of course, Troy itself is a walled city. The walls were built by Poseidon and Apollo, according to myth. So it's this very well fortified city that the Greeks probably won't be able to get into. There's a river running through the city, so they have fresh water. They're able to get food. There's very little chance that if the Trojans stay behind the walls, that the Greeks will be able to outweight them. This is a very well stocked and well fortified city. So this is the backstory. They've been there for 9 years, camped outside these walls and sacking cities in the area, waiting to try to get into Troy before the Iliad itself. So all this has happened before the Iliad. So we're throwing, it's called in media res, into the middle of the action. So after the action of the Iliad, which we'll be talking about this week, then we get the death of Achilles. It doesn't happen in the Iliad. The Trojan horse happens after the Iliad. We don't see that in the Iliad. And the return of the heroes, right? We're going to see that next week. That's the Odyssey. That's the heroes, specifically Odysseus returning home. We also get accounts of other heroes in that text, but this is the return of the heroes. So I just wanted to say, the Iliad is not the story of Troy, right? Like I said, there's all this stuff happening before the Iliad that is super important for if you want to talk about Troy. Instead, the Iliad is a tragedy of Achilles, right? This is all about Achilles. And that's why we'll just be reading a couple of the books from the Iliad that are about Achilles and his take on heroism and his debates about heroism and Greek values. Okay, so some questions to ask yourself: is Achilles a good person? Are we supposed to like Achilles? Is Hector the bad guy? A lot of people say that Hector is the real hero of this. Where do we see Cleos, Ados, Xenia, and Aristia play out in the Iliad? Thank you, and